not long ago, many of our conversations were, hey, but why don't you use Kubernetes for that? Today, conversations are going more into the direction, hey, why do you use Kubernetes for that?
This is DevOps Paradox, episode number 159. When to use Kubernetes. Welcome to DevOps Paradox. This is a podcast about random stuff in which we, Darren and Victor, pretend we know what we're talking about. Most of the time, we mask our ignorance by putting the word DevOps everywhere we can and mix it with random buzzwords like Kubernetes, serverless, CI/CD, team productivity, islands of happiness, and other fancy expressions that make us sound like we know what we're doing. Occasionally, we invite guests who do know something, but we do not do that often since they might make us look incompetent. The truth is out there, and there is no way we are going to find it. P.S. It's Darren reading this text and feeling embarrassed that Victor made me do it. Here are your hosts, Darren Pope and Victor Farsa. I was recently talking with someone that is in the process of migrating all of their monolithic applications to containers. Not a bad idea.
It's a good idea.
Well, and here's the maybe. They're also, instead of using some container as a service solution, they are in the cloud, specifically in AWS. They're setting up standalone EKS clusters and just trying to run those apps and trying to manage Kubernetes all at the same time. These aren't microservices. These are just standalone apps. And I said, you should probably be looking at App Runner. Heck, if nothing else, Elastic Beanstalk since you're in AWS. I mean, I would pick App Runner over that, or over Elastic Beanstalk, but come on, you don't need to be running EKS yourself.
Those apps can be baked into VMs and just plain old VMs.
Yeah, and just run Docker on the VM,
Yeah.
right? And they were completely convinced. It's like, no, we need to be managing our own Kubernetes cluster. And I went, okay, unlike what you were just saying there with the VM, I could get the auto restart, but if I lost the VM, it would be toast. At least in Kubernetes, it would get the magic of an auto restart and maybe be rescheduled somewhere else, but that's basically all it would buy me, right?
Yeah, I mean, to begin with, it gives you scheduling, right? So you need to ask yourself, do you want to decide where something runs, how something runs, or you want to leave that decision to a service? And I'm now using the term service very broadly. In this case, Kubernetes, right? So it's relinquishing control. Hey, I'm going to tell you that I have a new release of this application. You choose where to run it and how to run it, right? That's one of the many big differences, right? And now it sounds great. Hey, yeah, Kubernetes chooses that it should run this new release of this application on node 57. That's a great feature. But that might not work for every application, right? Maybe I don't want to, maybe I cannot choose even. Maybe it has to run here, right? Because of whatever architectural choices I made that were perfectly valid in the past and are questionable today.
So I guess the real question is, when should you use Kubernetes?
There are ideal scenarios and then less ideal scenarios, right? Ideal is ephemeral, not necessarily ephemeral, but relatively small distributed workloads of replicated applications. First, because Kubernetes is going to choose where to place things, and it will continue reshuffling those things during the lifetime of that cluster, right? Hey, I'm going to upgrade the cluster, let's say, by doing rolling updates, and Kubernetes is going to shut down that application and choose to run it somewhere completely different, right? Now, that doesn't have to be completely different. We can use states to choose where it's running, but I'm ignoring that for now, right? And that does not necessarily fit every scenario, right? I think that in one of the previous episodes, we talked about databases. Databases might not want to run somewhere else. You might not be able to upgrade that server by shutting it down and creating a completely new one. The perfect scenario is replicated applications that can replicated stateless applications. Let's put it that way. And I'm insisting on the word replicated because of that temporary nature of things that are running in Kubernetes. If you have one replica of something, then, reshuffling things might cause problems. And we can start with downtime if it's not replicated. So maybe the first question to the architecture would be, can you run multiple replicas? Do you want to run multiple replicas of that application?
Yeah, because if your min is 1 and your max is 1, you're going to have downtime when it upgrades.
Yes. I mean, you're going to have downtime if you upgrade anything. No, if you upgrade that, no matter whether it's Kubernetes or somewhere else, right? But by having it isolated, that's something that cannot be upgraded often because of downtime. You have easier time managing it, right? Because, hey, this is special. Maybe one of the criteria as a candidate for something running in Kubernetes would be, is it special? If it is, maybe you shouldn't. We all have special applications, right? Applications that we cannot treat in more or less the same way as all the other applications, like, cattle versus pets type of stuff.
I'm thinking back on this conversation again, and we were just going back and forth, and I could not convince them, I could not make a good enough argument that they did not need to run and manage their own Kubernetes cluster. Yes, it was going to be EKS, but there's still management there. I have to manage the node pools. I have to do all of those things myself. And that just doesn't make any sense if I'm running a single container application.
Single replica as well, I'm guessing.
And single replica, yeah.
Yeah. If you have one application, so do they have one application in total? They probably don't.
No, there were multiple applications, but they're all just single apps. They're not, they may make calls to each other, but not like a microservice level. It was like just a dependency. I can't imagine the level of maintenance nightmares you're going to have because, like I was just saying, managing the node pools, the upgrades of the cluster itself versus here's my image, go run it, right? That's all I want to do. And I could not convince them that that's what they should be doing.
There are arguments in favor of doing it as well. One is, hey, do you want something that is give or take standard? That's Kubernetes. Do you want to tap into a large pool of innovation happening right now? That's also Kubernetes kind of. How often do we hear now about new projects that are not Kubernetes first, right? But yes, going back to what you said, if you have a good service that does the thing and the cost is not an issue, they always cost a bit more. Yeah, give that to AWS, whatever, up.
The 98 different ways to run a container
exactly.
In AWS.
Whenever I'm about to mention the name of the service, my brain gets blocked because I don't know how to choose between hundreds of them, right?
Which one would you choose? I want to go back to something you just said there. The ability to run it anywhere. That was one of the arguments that they came back with. Is, well, we want to be able to take it and run it in any other cloud that we want to. I went, okay, well, how many other clouds have you actually even looked at? And he says, none. I went, how long have you been with AWS? He says, 10 years. I went, are you planning on moving away from AWS? No. I went, then why bother? Just use, I'm not saying not to do it, but you're currently still understaffed. You're trying to hire people. You've got people leaving. You're trying to get off of VMs and running images. Why do you want to create more work for yourself?
Look, I'm yet to find a company who actually did move workloads from one cloud to another. And when I say one cloud to another, I'm limiting myself to big three. I know from one cloud to another, which would include some less big names like Equinix, Metal, but that would be a completely different game, right? But from AWS to Azure, Azure to Google, Google to AWS, I never heard a single company doing that. I'm not saying that there isn't one, just to clarify. Just that I haven't been in contact with such a company. I know companies who use multiple clouds, just to clarify. But that's not the same as moving a workload from one cloud to another. That somebody uses Google for this and AWS for that, I've seen that. Moving an application from AWS somewhere else or vice versa? I'm really curious. I want to find. If you're such a company, I would like to talk to you. Honestly, I'm so curious to find who did it and get information about how it went.
Yeah, but even in this specific use case, it's a monolithic app, single container, min of one, max of one. I can easily do that in any of the big three.
Min one, max one. Hey, there is Lightsail.
Lightsail on AWS. You got Google Cloud Run on GCP. You got ACI on Azure.
Azure Container, ACA would be?
ACI.
No, now
Azure
there is
Container
Azure
Instance.
Container Apps.
Oh, apps. That's right, too. See, they're adding all the time.
Exactly.
As I'm saying, for a single, if you're not trying to come up with a microservice architecture, if this isn't greenfield and you're trying to do all the cool kit stuff, you're just trying to bring legacy into the 2020s. Having an image is good enough, and use a container as a service. The argument of, well, we might have to move from one cloud to the other. Okay, number one, you're not going to do that. Number two, if it's a single image, come on, you don't need to run Kubernetes yourself. Yes, you might have to pay a little bit more money if you were to sort of boil it down, but you also aren't having to pay that person tax of managing the clusters.
Kubernetes is amazing, right? I like it, and most of the topics we talk about is Kubernetes, but yeah, people are going crazy, and it must be Kubernetes. That's actually curious that not long ago, many of our conversations were, hey, but why don't you use Kubernetes for that? And today, conversations are going more into the direction, hey, why do you use Kubernetes for that? Not in terms of diminishing value of Kubernetes, because that's definitely not what I do, at least. But now we're not in a stage anymore trying to convince people to use Kubernetes. Now we're in a stage of trying to convince people that it's not necessarily Kubernetes always.
It's almost heretical, again, based on our track record. But do you really need that overhead?
You definitely don't.
I mean, most people don't. I mean, if you're going to treat Kubernetes as the OS, and you're going to re-platform, and platform is a word that I have a very strong love-hate relationship with. But if you're going to re-platform everything to run on top of Kubernetes, much like mainframe in the 60s and 70s and 80s, then at that point it sort of makes sense to have Kubernetes, right? I mean, that's where it would make sense. But then if that's architected correctly, you're not using Kubernetes. You would have some sort of service, if you will, Knative, that I'm thinking of specifically, that will just sort of make Kubernetes blend off into the background, because you as a application developer wouldn't care about it.
If you're trying to lift and shift, then definitely lift and shift, literally. So there's a thing, right? If you want to, the question really one should be asking, hey, do I want to move to some new platform? In this case, we're talking about Kubernetes, but it could apply to something else. And am I willing to invest whatever needs to be invested, which can be re-architecturing application. It could be rewriting application. It could be rewriting parts of application. It could be many, many different things, right? Or I really want to lift and shift because I'm moving everything to this, but in this case, AWS, and I want minimum amount of changes, right? If you want lift and shift, minimum amount of changes, we're just moving to AWS, that's the only real requirement, then yeah, the simplest possible solution is the solution. And the simplest possible is not Kubernetes.
Do you think right now that would be the hardest solution?
Depends on the level of experience, right? For somebody, it could be, for me, for example, Kubernetes would actually be easier because I'm more familiar with it, right? But in the case of the conversation you had, if I understood right, they're not really experienced in Kubernetes, so that cannot be the argument, right, in favor of it, experience. And then any AWS service that allows you to run things is just as good, right? Except maybe Lambda. Don't go Lambda. I'm pretty sure that their application is not Lambda candidate anyway. So
no, it's not. So if you're replatforming completely, not lift and shift, then it's an idea. Kubernetes could be the solution. Even if you're lifting and shifting, potentially it could be. But have you really counted the cost of managing A, And it would never be a single A Kubernetes cluster. You should have multiple Kubernetes clusters, in my opinion, if for no other reason to know how your application is going to react when you do the upgrade of the application and also upgrading Kubernetes cluster itself. Now, that doesn't have to be a long-lived cluster, but you're going to have a cluster that you're going to have clusters coming and going in a perfect world, right? Just thinking testing, staging, upgrades, how's this going to flow when I actually do this in production?
The trajectory of Kubernetes adoption is, when it's done right, is usually following the same pattern. You start with those applications that are, what people call microservices, smaller distributed, replicated applications first. And then you go down the stack into do stateless first, stateful second, smaller first, bigger ones second, and so on and so forth. Because you want to start with something that brings more value than something else. But what is curious in what you said like 10 minutes ago, you said they're 10 years in AWS, right?
Yeah, 10 plus years in AWS.
How are they running it now?
VMs and Elastic Beanstalk.
Okay. Yeah, just shove it into a container and into the same VM.
Yeah, I mean, you could still use Elastic Beanstalk and just, here's the image, keep going, right? There's no reason not to. But again, having the conversations, Kubernetes is not always the right answer. Running an image today, I believe, is the right answer, or running a container based on an image.
But it's still strange. What I'm about to say might not be the case of that company, but everybody has typically everything, meaning that they have some newer applications, some fancy front-end something, back-end something, right? Are they already running those in Kubernetes and now they're moving the older ones there, or they're starting with older ones, or they have nothing?
They have nothing
more recent.
No, nothing. It's all brand new.
That's very strange, because usually adoption of Kubernetes or even cloud, right? I mean, they're actually in cloud 10 years, so they're not a good example. But usually those things are followed as pressure to accommodate some new paradigm in applications, right? Hey, we are starting a new application of this and that type, and it would be a better fit for Kubernetes, for Lambda, for this or that, right? And then you start using something newer, let's say, for something that is designed for something newer. And then later on, you go towards moving potentially, maybe, the older stuff, right? Because then moving the older stuff makes more sense. Because let's say that I have 100 applications in my organization, and those 10 fancy ones, replicated, distributed, stateless, blah, 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 are already running in Kubernetes because they're a good fit there. And then you might make an argument to say, hey, look, I'm already actually running those 10% over there. I'm familiar with it. It works great, blah, blah, blah. And now I would benefit from moving others there for the sake of consolidation, right? Because those others would benefit from, and then you need to figure out what that is. Hey, service mesh, new fancy apps would actually benefit greatly if they could communicate with the old, less fancy apps through service mesh. I'm using a random example here, right? Or we are already having 5 people who are managing those Kubernetes clusters. Duplicating the workload would not result in duplicating the amount of people used to manage it, right? But that usually comes later. Usually don't start there.
So everything we've talked about up to this point is cloud-based. What if someone is still running self-managed on-prem? Or they could be in cloud, but they are not allowed to use the services for whatever silly reason. I could see where going to Kubernetes and managing that makes a lot of sense. Because at that point, you are replatforming from the mainframe, if you will. Right? Because at this point, if you have to do that, especially as an on-prem play, now everything we set up at this point, I believe, isn't necessarily fully negated, but pretty close.
Yeah, because if you're coming from on-prem, then your strategy could be to actually start running Kubernetes on-prem first before going to cloud.
I'm
And
saying
say-
there's no chance for you to even go to cloud. That's what I'm saying is
there
you
is
are
no
completely
chance.
on. Yeah, there is no chance you could. Now, obviously, Kubernetes is going to be the answer, but
Not necessarily, right? Kind of.
well-
if I have this application that needs to run on this server, then it needs to run on that server. Now, if I have this application that can run anywhere, on any server, that can be shut down and brought back, sorry, not application, that has replicas that can be shut down and brought back up, that we can upgrade, that we can downgrade, that so on and so forth, then yes, please run in Kubernetes. I love Kubernetes. But if it's hard to say, right? Don't start there. Don't start with stateful application. Let's put it this way. Don't go to Kubernetes with stateful application first. Don't go to Kubernetes with non-replicated application first.
So let's put it in the positive. Go to Kubernetes first with replicated stateless applications.
Yes. And you must have one. If you don't, then if your company doesn't have a single replicated stateless application, then you have other problems to deal with. You're trying to modernize one part of your system while neglecting the rest. And that's wrong. I cannot imagine that there is no use case for a single stateless replicated application. If you don't have that one, such a case, there is a problem over there. Most likely. Not necessarily always, but most likely.
So define stateless in this context. No state at all, no connections out to databases,
No.
nothing.
Connection, state always exists. There is no system without state. I'm saying this application A does not have state. It consults something else for state. Database, let's say.
Okay. Database, another service call, whatever. It's just not within itself, within its running, and also not volumes and whatever. It's,
Correct.
Okay.
No, that's a good kind of. Can you put it in a container without mounting volumes? And by mounting volumes, I'm excluding now config maps and secrets, kind of volume for persisting data. That's the first. If you don't have that candidate, then work on getting that candidate.
The second one onto that would be you're storing state in memory and non-replicated memory, right? So it's if it's an in-memory database and it goes down, it's the same problem, right? Again, everything has state, but if you're dependent upon that state, don't start with that one.
Yes, don't start. And later on, we might actually be talking whether you should go there or not. So there are two conversations, right? First, you don't start with that. And once you start with what you should start with, after that, we talk about your stateful applications again, right? And then see whether it makes sense or it doesn't. And also, there are applications that are that have architectures or are running on platforms that are directly contradictory with the whole Kubernetes logic, like WebSphere, right? Or WebLogic. They're basically designed to act as Kubernetes themselves. I'm not now trying to bash, use it, don't use it. That would be a different conversation. But they're designed to serve for the give or take same purposes as Kubernetes, right? To host your different applications.
Just not to the point of the normal scheduling that we see within Kubernetes today. So yeah, I agree.
Kubernetes has features that WebLogic doesn't, and vice versa. But both are, hey, here are my 10 applications. Run them, right? And from that perspective, they're serving the same purpose.
Yeah, I mean, just to simplify it even further, a Tomcat server, right? Here's my 10, I'll use your number, 10 war files, go run it.
Yes, with the difference, there is a huge difference is that I wouldn't actually, not much would change if I would put each of those 10 applications with a separate Tomcat. That wouldn't be much of a work. It would not much overhead in terms of CPU and memory, so on and so forth. So I can easily take 10 applications from one Tomcat and package them as 10 applications with Tomcat inside. I cannot do that with WebLogic. I mean, I can, but then I'm really signing that sentence.
Boy, that ended up in a very dark and dingy place. We went from Kubernetes, joy, happy, to WebLogic and WebSphere and Tomcat.
So here's a question for you. Did we ever before have a conversation where both of us were trying to discourage people from using Kubernetes? This is the first.
I think so. Yeah, I think this is the first time we've talked about it. I am not pro creating work for yourself because in the moment, you're thinking, oh, this isn't a big deal. That's your day 1, but you haven't considered day 30, or in this case, day 90 because of the quarterly releases.
Where we might differ a bit is, I do think that that company or any other company should run something in Kubernetes. If no other reason, because it's very important for a company to build that muscle, to get familiar with it, because only after you run it in production, you can start making those choices for real. So I do think that they should adopt Kubernetes. What I don't think is that they should go with legacy stuff, because I cannot believe that they don't have non-legacy stuff. If they don't have non-legacy stuff, then again, bigger problem at their hands. So they should, but let the team create something, whatever next you're working on. Let them create it using, I don't know, writing Go, Java, JavaScript, I don't care, a small application, take a fraction of that big monolith, try to figure out something new, use React, for example, right? I don't know, something. And then run it in Kubernetes, and then build that muscle. And once you do that, then great, yeah, you can start choosing from experience, based on operational experience, what to move from the old guard type of application.
Yeah, but I'm still going to push back. If you are already in AWS, I don't think you should be running your own EKS cluster. Right? If you're architecting an application in such a way you're going to be using service mesh or whatever, okay, yes, right? That's the answer for that. But if all you're doing is creating a simple image and you just need to run that image, you don't need Kubernetes.
Yes, but I could also now I'm reversing the roles, right? That's a first step, right? And that might be the last step, or there might be other steps that you will discover only after you do that first step, right? You shouldn't start with service mesh, we probably both agree, but you might discover them later once you start running it in a silly way, right? And there are many, many, many other examples. So I do think that it would be very valuable for that company to find out what would be a good scenario for Kubernetes and use it as a practice ground to see what to do and whether to do anything, right?
It should be skunkworks. It should not be production day 1.
Yeah, it's especially not with monoliths. So yeah, use it. Maybe you can create preview environments, for example, right? Maybe you can create development environments. There must be a better candidate to run in Kubernetes that you can use for selfish reasons. And those selfish reasons are to get operational experience with Kubernetes. And from there on, figure out what is a good fit.
And I think that's a great way to end it. Figure out what is the right fit for your organization. If you have any comments about this, head over to the Slack workspace and leave the comments in the podcast channel. We hope this episode was helpful to you. If you want to discuss it or ask a question, please reach out to us. Our contact information and a link to the Slack workspace are at devopsparadox.com/contact. If you subscribe through Apple Podcast, be sure to leave us a review there. That helps other people discover this podcast. Go sign up right now at devopsparadox.com to receive an email whenever we drop the latest episode. Thank you for listening to DevOps Paradox.